Hi, I'm Cameron Steer, the editor of Australian Outlook at the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Today I'm speaking with Elizabeth Collett. Elizabeth is the founding director of the Migration Policy Institute, Europe, and is senior advisor to the Institute's Transatlantic Council on Migration. She is in Australia as an EU delegate to the EU-Australia Leadership Forum. Thanks for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
Migration, and in particular the influx of refugees, is one of the leading contemporary challenges facing the European Union. In 2016 alone, EU member states granted protection to more than 700,000 asylum seekers. As a close observer, what do you think have been the major recent successes and failures of the EU's policies?
Well, I think at a basic level, the fact that the EU member states, or at least some of the EU member states, were capable of granting protection to that number of people should be seen as a success, ultimately. Overall, when we step back from the crisis and what has been achieved, I think one of the major developments has been a recognition across European governments that migration is a whole of government endeavour. Previously, it often just fallen to interior ministers to worry about it and a few other actors, but it's now been integrated into the priorities of not just foreign policy actors, but those involved in the Ministry of Employment, Ministry of Education, to understand that our changing communities and our changing diversity is part and parcel of their everyday work. And that's been a huge shift, both at the national level and the EU level. There are still challenges with that, but I think that's been a step forward. But for the European Union, after the implementation of the EU-Turkey deal in March 2016, I think, unfortunately, we haven't worked through all the major challenges that were raised and exposed during the crisis itself. We've kind of almost gone back to the status quo in many areas. So there's still an enormous amount to work out. And particularly in those countries that have less well-developed asylum systems, there's still an enormous amount of work to be done. So the goal of the next few years is to try and work through some of those.
Yep. The EU is placing an increasing onus on North African states to manage their borders and prevent people from crossing the Mediterranean to Europe. What are the difficulties inherent in this policy?
So this isn't necessarily a new policy for the European Union. The European Neighbourhood Policy has prioritised the management of migration in those states surrounding the EU for well over a decade. And the EU has created the global approach to migration, was created as far back as 2005, and they've discussed the external management of migration since the mid to late 90s. So this is not a new policy necessarily. What has changed is the amount of investment that's been put in place and the political prioritisation of this policy. So we see Chancellor Merkel going to countries like Niger. We see the head of state from Niger being present at the December European Summit. Niger has never been on the geopolitical priority map before for the European Union, so it's changed the way they work with some of these countries. The risk is over-prioritising and only be able to see foreign policy through a migration lens and the migration management lens. There are some important things that need to be done to build up capacity within those countries to counter smuggling, for example. But that needs to go hand in hand with an understanding of the security situation and the inherent instabilities in many of these countries. I mean, Libya right now is a country in crisis. It's not a country that has effective governance. So how far can you work with that non-government in terms of migration management? We have to be very, very circumspect about placing additional pressure to achieve one single goal and ignoring the broader security issues, the broader economic development issues, and the overall long-term stability of these countries. Because if they implode, the consequences for the EU, I think, are even more severe.
Although Australia is a hemisphere away, Europe's success or failure with regard to managing its refugee intake has real downstream effects on Australian immigration. What are the opportunities for cooperation, collaboration, and for the EU and Australia to learn from each other when it comes to refugee and immigration policies?
Well, there has been an enormous amount of at least political discussion about the EU's ability to adopt the Australian model, this sort of externalisation agenda of doing search and rescue in the high seas and then taking people to an external centre to have their asylum claim processed. That's proved to be a mixed success for Australia, but the idea of being able to break the link between an asylum claim and European territory has been extremely seductive for a number of policymakers. The Australian model is not something that can be easily transferred to the European model and isn't necessarily also desirable in a European context. So I think there are lessons to be learned about what not to do within the European Union in terms of trying to replicate too closely the experiences of other countries. But I think there are things that can be exchanged and learnt in terms of the bigger think about what the future of asylum and refugee policy should look like. Where should investments be made? How far can we invest in refugee populations, the vast majority of whom remain in the region of conflict, either within the state or in neighbouring states? Can we work together to invest more proactively in situations to prevent lives being left in limbo and not being made sustainable, but also then mass population movements that could be quite difficult to manage. And finally, I think, on the integration side, looking inside countries, Australia has a long experience in integrating its immigrant populations and thinking about equality. And I think, like European countries, there are still lessons to be learned, there are still tweaks to be made, and additional investments to be made. So some conversation about that between the EU and Australia, I think, would be really, really valuable.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with us
It's
today.
a pleasure. Thank you.